Number one.
Miss any part of the show? Every moment of every show is available in podcast form by searching Hans and Scotty on your favorite podcasting platform or online at KSLSports.com. This is Hans Olsen and Scotty G on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
Hans and Scotty, 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. One of our favorite dudes on the planet. Hardest working guy that Hans and I know.
Yeah, he'll get out there in the field.
I love it. Mitch Harper, Cougar insider for KSLSports.com, kind enough to join us. Who says there's an off season? There's never an off season for you.
Never an off season with Portal and now a new AD. So it's been busy times, but a lot of fun being down there in Provo today to see the first time this has happened in 2 decades. So I'm sure BYU's hoping it's another 20 years with Santiago, but we'll see how that goes.
You weren't surprised by this, right?
No, I wasn't. I was a little bit surprised at how it took 3 months for this to go on, because he just made the most sense, because he has so much knowledge of how BYU wants to execute and run the revenue sharing operation. And he understands what the board of trustees, the brethren, what they expect of how BYU is going to handle that, because you go on the outside, again, there's nuance to that, how BYU does things. So it makes all the sense to go with Brian Santiago and really continue the momentum that BYU has right now, which you could argue is maybe the best it's ever been.
What was your biggest takeaway from the presser?
I thought the takeaway that I had from Brian Santiago was he was hitting home nationally relevant. And that, to me, coincides with a lot of talk about eyeballs in this landscape of college athletics, where you have got to get eyes on the product more than ever before. And to be nationally relevant, you got to win big, and you got to be able to play the game in the offseason and construct rosters that give you national relevance all year. To your point, Scotty, about no offseason, BYU's finding ways to be nationally relevant, at least locally relevant, but in college basketball in particular, nationally relevant in the month of May, and the way that they're building out their program. So Santiago wants to continue doing that, and he kept hitting that message home, and I thought that was pretty noteworthy, that he wants BYU to be among the top programs and athletic departments in college athletics.
How much of the current landscape of the basketball program is due to Brian Santiago?
It's huge. He was critical in that process with getting Kevin Young to BYU. And, I remember sitting with Kevin Young in his office last August, and he credited, Brian Santiago with, this process and giving the resources and helping him and Tom Holmoe, but noted Brian Santiago as well. He's critical in that aspect, and he's got a lot of connections in basketball. But I do think another big thing with his role in basketball is well documented, but he did make it clear in a breakout session with the media, football does drive the bus. And he wanted to get that message home, because there is a belief that, he's just a basketball guy. And I think you guys have talked about it on this show quite a bit, that BYU does need to have a football person that understands that football does move that. And he kind of set the tone and laid it out there that football at BYU is the number one priority. I saw Tom Holmoe a couple years back it was a Las Vegas function where he's working the room. He was getting an award, but he knew pretty much everyone in the football world, whether it was ADs, school presidents, former players. He's got a lot of connections in football. You now lose that, where Brian Santiago is not as well connected in the football game. How does that, impact his ability, with overseeing the football program? It's nicer now because BYU's in a league and they've got their schedules booked out pretty much to 2032. But I think hitting that message home was important for him, because on the surface, you just say he's a basketball guy that always has his morning runs and all he cares about is hoop. But football obviously is the moneymaker, and that's what's got to continue to be the top priority.
Well, you'd have to have your eyes closed pretty shut and ears plugged up pretty good in order to not hear some of the criticisms of this hire. I think that it's out there pretty widely.
Ep.
That there are some that don't favor this. He addressed it in his presser. I don't know if you asked the question or who asked the question of, you hear the criticism. What do you think? How did you feel about how he answered that, and where do you think the bulk of this criticism is coming from?
It's a good question. I do think that, as far as I think it was Jay Drew from the Deseret News, who asked the question to Brian Santiago, and I thought that Brian addressed it as well as he can. You're not going to appease everyone, but he did highlight that he's really competitive and passionate, and maybe that sort of attitude and behavior has rubbed people the wrong way that are, whether it's Cougar Club donors and they haven't been valued enough. Because I think whenever people put their hard-earned money on the line into something, they want to be treated with a lot of respects, but obviously there's tiers to that. But I think he did, good enough job to, his messaging that he is a different guy from when he first got on campus 27 years ago, as he pointed out. But he's going to have to, take time to mend those fences. I don't think it's going to be healed by any of those, comments he said today. For people that don't like him, that are not a fan of his hire, I don't think anything he said today is going to suddenly win them over. Now, how do you win them over as an AD? Maybe it's just winning, maybe showing more value to that individual donor or fan or whoever it is. But, it is interesting when you just think of what's the cause of this, because it's pretty rare to have a deputy AD have such a vocal pocket of people that are pretty outspoken. I mean, I think most ADs could walk around, fans and most people wouldn't even know who the ADs are, let alone a deputy AD. But he definitely has his share of critics, and he acknowledged that and was willing to address that it is a fair question and criticism, and he's got to do his part to, try to win those people over. And it'll be interesting to see what he can do to actually make that happen.
I want to clarify when I say this, I don't know Brian very well. I've only interacted with him a handful of times, and even then it was just a handshake and hello. Tom, I knew pretty well. Yep. And I think I speak for a lot of people. So I'm kind of generalizing here. The vibe I always got that Tom was the good cop, Brian was the bad cop. And that and when you become the bad cop and then you become the guy, how much does he have to mold himself in kind of a different way now that you're the guy?
Yeah, I think that Tom definitely made everyone feel valued, whether it was coaches, whether it was boosters, everyone felt respected. And I think that's why Tom Holmoe built up a pretty good network of connections, and he always kind of determined his successes on relationships, and it honestly worked for BYU during the independence era. I think Santiago has changed, and I think being at BYU kind of does this to people where, I don't know if the word soft is the right word, but it's a little bit different edge. Even when Kalani was at Utah, he was a different guy. He was wired different. He was a defensive coordinator, sure. Same with Jay Hill. Kevin Young, I don't think we knew much about him before he got to BYU, but I think being at BYU kind of just changes people, and now Santiago is going to be more in the spotlight, and I think that alone will naturally change him a little bit in his approach and style, because you do have to get everyone on board. You've got to have all those coaches on board to the vision, because this is going to be a crazy summer where House versus NCAA, it's going to usher in a new era once it does get settled of college athletics, where potentially you're talking roster limits, you're talking about revenue sharing, making sure that you're still, keeping up with resources from the facility side of things, because that's still a piece to all of it. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how kind of he maneuvers things. But I would expect that his personality will have to change in this role as AD.
What do people need to know about who Brian Santiago is?
He's got the potential to take BYU to heights they've never experienced before. And I think he's got, his competitiveness and passion was another piece that he really kind of hit home in his commentary today and multiple questions. That does shine through. And, he wants BYU to be at the highest levels. I think that's the messaging from all of BYU, period. And that's showing itself with the way that, their commitments to basketball and improved commitments with football. You're seeing that. But I think Santiago wants to take it to an even higher level where, they're winning more, they're hanging more banners, and they're going to go make sure they can do it within, the BYU way. As they've been very vocal, BYU's people above Brian Santiago, not going to be the highest bidder, all things like that, but be very competitive to go win and do things that really the athletic department hasn't done before. For all the successes that Tom had, and he ultimately got BYU into the Big 12, and that's where you could say build a statue because he got the job done. But now it's a matter of winning titles. BYU hasn't won much. They haven't got to a playoff. They haven't, reached a Final Four or an Elite Eight. Sweet 16 was a great step in the right direction. But now it's about winning titles and really, taking the brand to a higher level. And I think Santiago's got the personality to really motivate and get the most out of coaches to where they feel like you don't feel complacent anymore at BYU. There was a stretch in the WCC independence era where I think Cougar fans felt like BYU just content with what they do. And now I think there's going to be it's going to feel a little bit more like what you see around the country where you got to win. There's a lot on the line financially. You got to take it to the highest levels. He believes in Kalani Sitake and Kevin Young, and I think that's a great starting point, and Lee Kumar, too, on the women's basketball side. I think these are exciting times for BYU. This offseason's been very eventful in its own right, but I think he's got the personality and competitiveness that might be needed in this landscape that's as competitive as ever in college athletics.
Well, you bring up a good point, too, because, obviously it's well documented that BYU is spending money very freely to build rosters that can be competitive with anybody in the country, especially on the basketball side. But with that comes expectations and
huge
way
pressure.
higher expectations than we ever thought. You just wanted to hang with Gonzaga back in the day and maybe finish second in the conference. Now it's like, no, go win a Big 12 title and go make it to the Final Four because we're paying for it.
I agree. And, to me, anything less than an Elite Eight would feel like a disappointment, I think, for next year for basketball.
Yeah.
You got to get farther than what you did this past year with the commitment, the talent that you've got. You can't always assume you're going to get the number one recruit. So high expectations. And it was interesting, too. Brian noted on the topic of basketball, he noted that today he's going to have his first meeting will be with the football program. He wants to make sure everyone's on board with his vision on football. But he also said he wants to lock in Kevin Young, too. And, I followed up and asked him, I said, is there concern that you need to lock him in? And he acknowledged that the Phoenix Suns are still out there and that, that they got to make sure to always have him committed and on board. So I thought that was noteworthy that he just, admitted and was honest about that they got to make sure that he's happy and on board with what he's doing. And again, Kevin Young's been complimentary of Brian Santiago, and you've seen BYU basketball assistants be very complimentary of Santiago on social media since the hire happened last night. But, so again, being competitive and understanding that this is a big business and BYU can still have its way they do it in a unique way, but you got to keep up. And I think what's also interesting, too, is that BYU's in a league where they can try to be maybe the big dog. And that's still up for grabs in the Big 12. And he's got to be the guy, Kalani and Kevin Young, to go chase that mantle.
I know things are in a really good spot right now for Kalani and for Kevin Young. Do you believe Brian Santiago would be more aggressive in a fire and hire situation than Tom Homo was?
I would believe so because, BYU's got a track record of always having ability to get good coaches despite its limited pool. It's honestly kind of shocking, really, how they've hit it out of the park with many of their coaches despite the small pool. So I don't want to say there's always someone that you can get, but I think there's going to be an expectation to win at a very high level consistently, not just have 111-win football season and 3 to 4 years of mediocrity. I think there's going to be more pressure to deliver. Now, Kalani Sitake is locked in, and he got the long-term extension, and that was a big priority, and Brian Santiago was involved with that. I remember talking to Brian at the Alamo Bowl about that, and he was involved. Tom Homo brought him involved with that process. So they're on board with, having Kalani Sitake as the head coach. But I think if things go completely south and you're losing in sub-500 records where revenues are more important than ever before, that's going to affect ticket sales, which then go back to paying the players. BYU's times are good right now, but you can't always assume it's always just going to be sold-out crowds every single night because there will come a time when you get a little bit of fatigue as a fan, I'm sure, of here's Oklahoma State again. It's nice right now, but after a couple years and it's happening over and over, and if you're a sub-500 team, well, you got to step it up, and those revenues are more important than ever because you're paying back athletes with that money.
Mitch, you're the best, man. Appreciate it. Great stuff
Mitch.
as always.
Thanks, guys.
There he is, Mitch Harper. You can read him on KSLSports.com. Cougar Insider does a tremendous job, hardest working guy out there. If you're a Cougar fan, you got to have him locked and loaded because he provides great information and does it the right way, too. This is 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.